Alright, so this is one of our longer lectures, so we're going to cover actually a couple of things, but we can kind of start off with the essential question about what is alternation of generation. And how do we describe plant life cycles? There we go. Basically, the middle bit there. So we're going to move through this, but just to reiterate, we've got alternation of generations where we're switching between haploid and diploid stages. We've got a gametophyte, which is our gamete-producing plant, so gamete-producing plant, and a sporophyte, which is a spore-producing plant. Okay, so phyte is always plant. I'm trying to speed through because I know how you guys like it when I make these things shorter. Okay. We're going to come back to these and look at kind of where we alternate, and so we'll give some examples of these guys. I will say most are dominated by the sporophyte, so the thing that you're going to see outside, if we're looking at a tree, if we're looking at something, it's going to be a sporophyte. Okay. Just to kind of reiterate, I'll give you the whole life cycle, and you can always go back to the other video at the end where I go through each step. But the idea is if we start off with the gamete plant, it's going to be haploid. Every single cell within that whole plant will be haploid and have one set of chromosomes. So it'll undergo mitosis to make sperm and eggs. So notice it's mitosis this time to make the sperm and egg because we're going one end to one end. So keeping them the same uses mitosis. Okay, when they go through the whole process, then obviously we'll have fertilization. So 1N plus 1N will give us 2N. And so we'll have our first diploid or diploid part of this cycle. Then it will grow by, again, mitosis because it's keeping the number the same. 2N to 2N means that we're using mitosis. Then we get a whole other plant that grows. Okay, oops. Get a whole other plant that grows. Okay, and then when that plant is ready, it will go and undergo meiosis. So 2N to 1N, the only time we get meiosis is right here. Going 2N to 1N to make spores. Those spores will land somewhere and they will grow and develop using mitosis again. So most of this process is mitosis, but only the sporophyte to the spores uses meiosis. Okay. Nope, we have the dog joining us. She's noisy. Come on. Oh, now she's not going to follow. All right, well, there you go. So to give you some examples, and I will say that, well, let me get this dog. All right, there we go. I wish you could see the dog at this point in time. But we're doing plants, doggy. We're doing plant stuff. Okay. Took this long in the year for my dog to make a presence known in videos. Alright, well, I'll show it to you. The main general diagram is the one that you really need to know. So the one that's sort of been covered twice now is the important one. But I'll show you kind of what's going on in the moss life cycle. So if we sort of look at these will be our gametophytes, just like we had before. So our whole little gamete plant. It's going to undergo mitosis to create the sperm and the egg. And it's showing you a gametangium, which just means the place where the gametes are made within the plant. And so egg and sperm are made via mitosis. And then at some point, sperm makes it to the egg. We've got fertilization. That's what's happening here, is the sperm is going down to meet the egg, so we have a zygote. That's now diploid or diploid and undergoes mitosis, but it does it kind of out of the top part of this plant. So this is the only time we see the little sporophytes in mosses and things like that. It will, again, this is our only time we undergo meiosis, is from the sporophyte. So it creates spores, which will land somewhere, and then via mitosis will grow into a whole gametophyte. But this up here is our whole sporophyte. So that's why I say most of the time what you see is the fuzzy stuff for moss, and so that's a gametophyte. Again, you don't have to know too much about that, but that's really the only one. These guys up top, if we were to see this part, that's the actual sporophyte. And it's just not as often that we see it. Alright, so most other things, the sporophyte is what's present. And if I said it wrong, gametophyte is the thing that we see most in mosses, but then everybody else we're going to see the sporophyte. I have struggled for a long time to find one of these little guys, so we rarely see the gametophyte of the fern, but what it is it's just like a tiny little heart-shaped plant, really small. Okay, it will then form gametes, again, egg and sperm, or what we see here. They will join together through fertilization and make a zygote, which undergoes mitosis to develop into the entire plant. So the whole little fronds that we see here of the fern are the sporophyte. So they're spore producers. And these guys, because again, they don't have seeds yet, they just produce spores kind of on the back side of the leaves, the leaflets. And so you can see those there. They'll produce and release spores, which undergo meiosis, and once those guys land, they'll go through mitosis again. So it's the whole same process, just different pictures. So if this is seeming kind of overwhelming to you, and you're like, there's a lot of like green stuff and pictures, and I'm not seeing what's going on, it's fine. Just the big thing is to know the general diagram. So in case you're not listening, which I hope you are. Just know the general diagram. I'm more happy with that than all of these nuances. I'm just showing you that they do exist and how they kind of apply to other things. So here's our kind of sporophytes, the little fronds. Okay. And then you can see actually where the spores are produced back there in the back. We call those sporangia, like spore spots. Okay, so two groups of seedless plants formed vast ancient forests and low-lying wetlands during the Carboniferous period. And so they're lycophytes and manilophytes, so that's our ferns and club mosses. So when these plants died, they formed peat deposits, which eventually formed coal. So these guys are actually what lead us to have some coal. All right. Coal, oil, natural gas, or fossil fuels. Oil and natural gas formed from marine animals, but coal formed from seedless plants. So just a kind of a general thing, the whole fossil fuels, a lot of it actually comes from our seedless vascular plants that died over time. Although there's lots of jokes about like dinosaurs and whatever, dinosaur bones. Really, a good majority of this comes from fossil fuels, come from these seedless plants. So burning fossil fuels would actually release the CO2 that's stored in there and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's kind of what gives us more stuff into the environment, more of those greenhouse gases, leading to some of the global climate change. So you see, say, like back in the day, they had these really massive ferns before the kind of development of the seed plants back in the back. Okay, so temperature dropped during the late Carboniferous period, and we had glaciers, and climate turned drier, and vast swamps and forests began to disappear. And so we have this wind-dispersed pollen and protective seeds gave those seed plants a competitive advantage. So it's kind of in this time that, like, okay, so wind dispersion, because the last two that we looked at were all kind of dispersion by water. Okay, so the wind dispersion is a new thing. So our gymnosperms and our angiosperms, so these are our seed ones, or little dudes with seeds. There we go. It's terrible. There we go. Okay. Have pollen grains that carry the sperm-producing cells through the air. So the offspring of seedless plants are sent off to the world as haploids. So seedless plants are sent off into the world as haploid single-celled spores that must survive independently as gametophytes before producing the next sporophyte generation. So a lot of things happening here. Seed plants launch next generation sporophytes that are ready to grow. So it's kind of, it looks crazy. But here's the thing. There are specialized structures within sporophytes that house the reproductive stages. We've got spores, eggs, sperm, zygotes, and embryos. We'll look at them. In gymnosperms, such as pines and other conifers, that structure is the cone. So the cone's the thing that houses all the reproductive stages. So all of them are within that cone. There, I'll make you a cone. Okay. We'll look at it later. We'll go back through some of these diagrams because there are some really nice animations that might be able to show it to us and make some sense out of it. But the whole idea is that we actually have the spore producers or the spore carriers within those cones. Okay, so in the male reproductive structures of seed plants, haploid spores develop into pollen grains. So haploid spores develop into pollen grains, which are then the male gametophytes. So when we experience it this spring and there's pollen everywhere, it's the whole entire male, like, gamete plant. That's what that is. So pollen, the shorthand this, practice that, is the male gamete plant. So it's our haploid generation. It's in like an entire plant housed in there, which is why I think my whole body freaks out. Like this, it's a whole tiny plant. So I'm gonna get watery eyes and stuff. I'm gonna have to live on Zyrtec. So if a pollen grain lands on a compatible female structure, then we get pollination. And so it undergoes mitosis to produce a sperm. Same basic thing. So we're going from male gamete plant to mitosis to sperm, just like we talked about before. So in seed plants, though, the sperm is reduced to a nucleus. So it gets really, like, it gets more complicated, and I'll show it to you. But we'll talk more about, like, plant structures here in a bit. Alright, so haploid spores and female reproductive structures develop into ovules. These contain the egg-producing female gametophytes. Okay, so in the ovules is where we get the egg-producing female gametophytes. If pollination has occurred, the pollen grain grows down a tiny tube to enter the ovule and release sperm into the nucleus. Only then does fertilization occur. This one's better to see in the actual pictures, so I'll show it to you. If we're in, so we're with the seed producing, but the ovule and its surrounding tissues will mature to become a whole seed coat that also has an embryo and a food supply in it. So the ovule, the whole female kind of plant part, actually will make the embryo, food supply, and seed coat. Alright? So here's sort of what we would look at, and we'll do this part quickly, but really it's like if we have the pollen grain, which is our male gametophyte, it will enter into the certain area where it's supposed to. It'll grow a whole little tiny tube, and it will actually meet with the female there, the female plant, or female gametophyte. Look how reduced those are, how tiny that is. This is male gametophyte, this is female gametophyte. They all do this within the cone, right? So then, once they kind of come together, that's our fertilization, that's our embryo. But it also means that this entire section becomes a food supply and a protective coating for that seed. Okay, so that's the basic part. Now there's a lot happening there, so this is a good place to take a break to kind of review that. If you're still with me in the room, ask some questions, because we moved through that a little bit quickly, so you may have to slow down. So no organism makes a showier display of their sex life than angiosperms. So flowers are the sites of both pollination and fertilization. Okay, so all the stuff that's going to happen, sort of like the cone was before, all the reproductive stuff for gametophytes and forming into a zygote and those kinds of things happen within the cone. They're all going to happen at the side of the flower here. So flower house a separate male and female sporangia and gametophytes. So our whole male and female plants will be housed within these. Okay, we'll look at pictures. Okay, there's some good examples. Passion flower is my favorite. It looks like a little alien flower. Here's some important stuff. So this is another part of like the plant life cycle, but we'll do some things related to this because there's going to be some things that we need to know as far as how flowers and angiosperms reproduce. So flowers consist of sepals, and these enclose the flower before it opens. So this is sort of like when you see the flower and it's about to bloom. I'm going to give you a terrible picture there. But you see it's about to bloom, and then eventually you get these little seeds, and like the pretty flower is in there. These kind of like leaves on the outside that enclose this that enclose it before it opens, sort of like the flower bud. Those are the sepals. Okay. They'll stay with it, but they beforehand enclose the flower. Petals are what you know, and these guys attract the animal pollinators. We have stamens, and these include a filament and an anther, and it's a sac at the top of each filament that contains the male sporangia to release pollen. So these are going to have the male part. So I think stamen has the word men in it. So this is our male part, our men part. Okay. Carpels are going to be the female reproductive structure, and it includes a stigma, a style, and ovary. Okay, and it'll have an ovary, which is an adaptation of that ovule we talked about before. Keep it moving here. Maybe this thing will let me. Okay, so here's sort of what it looks like. So beforehand, we had the sepal that kind of enclosed the flower, but now the sepal's down here. And I'm underlining the key points to know here, by the way. Okay. Then we have the petals, and that's the showy bits that you guys should know. The stamen just about always looks like this one. There's going to be the filament and the anther, so we need to know that. And then the stamen. So that's our male part. And then the thing in the middle, sometimes they can have more than one, but this one's a good one that just demonstrates one, is that in the center there'll be a carpel, and it's usually about that shape. And there's the stigma, which is the sticky part on top, the style, which is sort of the long tube, and then the ovary, which houses kind of where the seeds will form. So the ovary is there. And so all those parts lead us up to the carpel, which is the whole female part of the plant. All right, key events. I'll show you what's going on, but it's just so you have the words and we can read through them quickly together. If you work better with the words, you can pause it or you can take a look at the actual lecture notes online. But the key events here. So meiosis in the anthers of the flower produce the haploid spores. Okay, so meiosis is so our little sporophyte is going to produce our spores through meiosis. Okay, so that undergoes mitosis to form the male gametophytes or pollen grains. So our pollen grain is our entire gametophyte. Meiosis in the ovule, meiosis then produces a haploid spore that undergoes mitosis to form new cells of a female gametophyte, which would become the egg. It's a lot. Pollination occurs when a pollen grain carried by wind or animal or whatever it is lands on the stigma. A pollen tube will grow down from the pollen grain to the ovule. The tube carries a sperm that will fertilize the egg, and so then we get our zygote. That one makes sense to us. Each ovule develops into a seed consisting of an embryo surrounded by a food supply, and then a seed coat derived from the integuments. We'll look at it. Okay, so an ovule develops into a seed. This is an important one. Okay, and while the seeds develop, the ovary's walls thicken, and that's when we get a fruit. So the ovary will lead to a fruit. Ta-da! And so when conditions are favorable, a seed will germinate, which means it will begin to grow to make us a whole new sporophyte. So let's look at this. Not in this one, not in this one, not in this one, though we'll look at it. Okay, so through meiosis, we're going to get the male gametophytes, the pollen grains, and then the female, the egg within the female gametophyte here. I'll go through this one kind of quickly. Okay, when the conditions are right, the pollen grain will stick to the stigma, and then it grows this long pollen tube down, and then it'll deliver sperm to the ovule, which is here. So this is sort of what's in this place. Let's see if I can make a line. That's what's right there. Okay, so those two things are meeting after this thing grows a pollen tube. Then we have fertilization. So you see the tube here, and then we have fertilization where we have a zygote. Okay, the whole thing will change to where we get an embryo, we get a seed coat, we get a food supply, and we have this whole thing become a fruit, the mature ovary with the seeds in it. I cannot get this thing to move. All right, when conditions are right, those seeds will then germinate and we get a brand new sporophyte again. Okay, and then the sporophyte, again, at the anthers and at the ovary will develop via meiosis and make us new male and female gametophytes. So you can see the male and female gametophytes, kind of, but they're super, super reduced. So all the showy bits here are the sporophytes. I know, it's quite a bit. We'll look at it. This is another good place to take a break if you need to take a break. Okay. Make sure you look at it, see what the key terms are. If you have questions for me, write them down, put them on a sticky note, something like that. Let's see what we need to kind of go through. We'll look at some animations and we'll talk about it next time for sure, but we need to know the parts, the flower parts. Okay, so fruits are going to be ripened ovaries of flowers, and they're adaptations that actually help disperse seeds. So seed dispersal mechanisms rely on wind, sometimes we hitch rides on animals, and then sometimes it just has fleshy edible fruits that attract animals, because if you eat them and then the seeds go through the digestive system, when they're pooped out, then they have a natural fertilizer. Isn't that fascinating? Again, we got lots of animations we can look at. So there's some wind ones like you see with the dandelion. Some of them with these little stickers we've all kind of experienced, and they'll actually hitch rides on animals, which is actually, when you think about it, kind of a smart way to do that. Some other ones, like little berries, are adapted so when an animal eats them, they go through the digestive system, and then wherever they land, they have a little poop fertilizer, and they can grow. Hopefully, if they don't land in like a parking lot or something like that. So we depend on fruits and seeds of angiosperms for much of our food. Corn, rice, wheat, and other grains or dry fruits. We also have apples, cherries, tomatoes, and squash that are fleshy fruits. Spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, cumin, cloves, ginger, and licorice are also angiosperm fruits. Okay. Pepper fruits are harvested before ripening and then dried, and that's how we get peppercorns. That'll give you, peppery flavor. There you go, your peppercorns, and that's how they end up. So about just an evolutionary connection, about 90% of angiosperms use animals to transfer their pollen. So this is a real kind of co-evolutionary thing, is that it works for angiosperms to work well with animals. So birds are usually attracted to colorful flowers. They don't really care about the scent, but if it's like big and pretty, they like those. Most beetles are attracted by fruity odors, but are kind of indifferent to color. I know some beetles too are kind of attracted to like rotting flavors and odors. We've got some night-flying bats and moths that are usually attracted to large, highly scented flowers. Okay. Wind-pollinated flowers typically produce large amounts of pollen because it's not as directed as having an actual pollinator that will get it there for you. Okay. I know bees are usually attracted to like whites and yellows and things like that because in the UV spectrum they really pop. Okay. So things that attract, we're gonna have lots of attractive things for different animals. Like here's a bee being pollinated or pollinating an orchid, which really works out this whole evolutionary advantage for them. Early hunter-gatherer humans made use of any edible plant species available at the time, but modern agriculture has actually narrowed the pool of food plant diversity by creating a select few genotypes possessing the most desirable traits. So we've actually limited some of the genetic diversity because of agriculture, which is interesting for me because I've worked through agriculture stuff, so I'm like, pros and cons of agriculture. We could have a different discussion on that one day. Most of the world's population is now fed by varieties of rice and wheat and corn and soybeans that require specific cultivation techniques. And agriculture has really changed our landscape. I was thinking agriculture has changed our landscape architecture is where my brain was going. We actually have some new crops that may come from hundreds of species of nutritious fruits, nuts, and grains that people gather and use locally. So if we can get some local things, we add some more to it. I don't remember what these are exactly, but, It's like we don't use jackfruit a whole lot here, but I know that jackfruit is used in a lot of other countries. That one's another one that's coming through. There's also the durian. I've been watching things on Facebook recently. So there's lots of local plants that actually could give us diversity as far as our kind of food intake. But as plant biodiversity is lost through the extinction and habitat destruction, we lose potential crop species and some genetic diversity. So that's kind of, honestly, some real bummers of this whole situation, is that we lose habitat, we lose potential crop species, we lose genetic diversity. Okay. You can kind of see what happens is we just end up taking over land and putting kind of people in it, and so that removes some of our areas of where we could do like agriculture. So I don't know, one of these days I feel like I would try like a home garden. I'm not always the best at green thumb, but you know, it's the way it goes. It's worth trying. So that's actually going to be later on. We'll move to chapter 31 next time. I want to say this one's fairly short for you guys, which I know looking at it you will like, but it is a fairly dense sort of lecture episode, if you will. So work your way through that one. If you guys have questions at all or are not sure, we'll get back to class and practice it, but shoot me an email. Let's figure it out and make sure that we're on the right track together.